Last week, we continued the prelude of our Eastern Front of World War II week-by-week series with an episode on the development of the newly created Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, tracking its professionalization as it fought the Civil War and the Reconquest Wars of the 1920s and the rebuilding of the Red Navy and Red Air Force afterwards. This week, we will focus on the Reichswehr of the Weimar Republic in Germany during the same period. We will track its development as its leaders begin reckoning with the imperial military's failures in the First World War. Additionally, we will look at the growing unrest in the fledgling democracy and the failure to contain the threat of fascism. This series dives deep into complex and often sensitive historical topics that may not always align with YouTube's guidelines, so your support is essential. By becoming a member or patron, you're helping keep this project alive and ensuring we can continue delivering high-quality content to our viewers without worrying about demonetization. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment, and gain access to future Eastern Front videos and 200 other exclusive episodes. Immediately following the armistice of 1918, the Allies occupied the left bank of the Rhine, as well as 3 major cities, Cologne, Mainz and Koblenz. This constituted the industrial heartland of Germany and signified the true depths of the defeat. Imperial Germany was in full collapse. The army was defeated in the field, the navy was in open revolt, and the Kaiser had abandoned his throne for the protection of the neutral Netherlands. Among these ashes, a new democratic government emerged. Today it is referred to as the Weimar Republic, after the city in which it was founded. In its own time it was known as the German Republic. This new government struggled from the very start with tensions between far-left and far-right elements of society. The earliest days of the Republic bore witness to a sailors' revolt, inspired by communists and other leftist groups. This revolt threatened to plunge the country into a fully fledged civil war. This was only narrowly avoided by the pact between the First Chancellor, Friedrich Ebert, and the Quartermaster General of the Army, Wilhelm Gruner. The details of this pact were never written down, and only Gruner's side of the story is known today. According to the general, he offered Ebert the support of the army if Ebert promised to destroy all of the earliest elements of communism within the military and to bring about a peaceful transition of power. This agreement secured the fledgling republic in its earliest days and became known as the Ebert-Groener Pact. The remnants of the Imperial Army were split into 2 main forces, those on the Western Front and their compatriots on the Eastern Front. It was on the Eastern Front where the situation demanded the highest level of attention. Here, states that had not existed in hundreds of years, if ever, were being born into the tumultuous post-war world. German volunteers, organized into something akin to mercenary companies, roved the battlefields of Eastern Europe. These became known in German as Freikorps. The Freikorps would play a part in nearly every one of the independence wars in what was previously the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires, but were rarely the decisive factor as their numbers were never very large. They proved to be fertile ground for several future Nazi leaders, including Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Martin Bormann, and Richard Walter-Darré. These Freikorps were more than mere soldiers of fortune fighting in the wars in Eastern Europe. In 1919, they fought for the government to put down various uprisings and attempt to create independent enclaves in the former German Empire. The most notable of these was the Bavarian Socialist Republic, which survived about 3 weeks before being crushed by 30,000 men of various Freikorps by orders of the Republican government. But by 1920, the tide had changed. The military and the Freikorps were no longer so easily distinguished as before. Many officers in the Reichswehr were also commanders of Freikorps detachments. These officers felt that their loyalty to the state was only a tenuous connection to be observed when the state's interests aligned with their own. In February of 1920, the defense minister ordered the disbandment of 2 Freikorps in Berlin. This was opposed by General Leutwitz, commander of the military district around Berlin. For several days, there was a tense standoff between Leutwitz and the civilian authorities. On March 10th, the general met with President Ebert. He demanded a dissolution of the government and was promptly refused. The situation escalated, and the Freikorps men marched on the government offices. This was unopposed by the police or the regular army, and resulted in the government fleeing to Dresden. The Kapp Putsch, as it became known, only faltered when the president called for a general strike that crippled the putschists' attempts to normalize their control over Berlin and the rest of the country. The leaders fled the country with the assistance of the police, and the government returned to Berlin within days. The long-term effects of the Kapp Putsch on the young republic are still debated. However, it is often overshadowed by its far less successful sibling, the Beer Hall Putsch, which occurred in 1923. Munich, Bavaria was the scene of the attempted coup. The Nazi Party was still a small organization on the fringes of society at the time, one of the right-wing parties in a league known as the Kampfbund. Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party and the Kampfbund at this time. He had played a minor role in the Kapp Putsch, but had escaped the authorities' notice. Dissatisfied with the progress of Gustav Ritter von Kahr in a larger national coup attempt, the Kampfbund decided to act to take Bavaria into their own hands. In November of 1923, Hitler, Ludendorff and the Kampfbund made their move. Ludendorff wholeheartedly agreed with the goals of the Nazi Party at this time, having been one of the original sources of the stab-in-the-back myth that was critical to Hitler's movement. They marched on a beer hall where Kahr was giving a speech, surrounding it with members of the SA. Once they had the leaders of the Bavarian government in hand, Hitler demanded that they subordinate themselves to him and his new revolutionary government. Kahr and the others refused, and from this point, the putsch started to crumble. Hitler's SA members were trying to secure arms from the local armories, and, failing to convince the Reichswehr garrison to defect, were soon in trouble. As this and other crises began to spring up around the city as his men were flailing about, Hitler left the beer hall to personally attempt to solve a situation on the other side of the city. This was a mistake. Ludendorff blundered by letting Kahr walk free after Hitler left, which allowed Kahr to organize resistance to the putsch and meet with his supporters. By the end of the first night, it was clear to all that the putsch had all but failed. Ludendorff advocated for a final march to demonstrate the strength of the putschists, and Hitler agreed. This march was met by determined resistance of Reichswehr troops and police along the way. After an exchange of gunfire that left more than a dozen casualties, the putsch collapsed. Hitler and Ludendorff went their separate ways, both fleeing to the countryside. Within days, both were put on trial, along with several of their co-conspirators. Ludendorff would be acquitted of his charges of aiding and abetting treason. Hitler was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in a light security prison that would enable him to enjoy visitors, an exemption to forced labor, and the ability to hone his thoughts into the infamous book Mein Kampf. He would actually only serve 8 months and pay a fine. The Weimar Republic had survived another coup attempt, but it had not managed to solve its reactionary extremist problems. This failure would haunt the Republic for the rest of its short life. The Reichswehr of the 1920s, as we have seen, was busy engaging in coups, putting them down, and playing coy with the Republican government. When they were not doing all this, the army was busy trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism in its treaty-limited forces. The Treaty of Versailles not only restricted the size of the German army, where it could be stationed in the country and what equipment it could use, but also restricted the actual organization of the army. It was limited to a total of 100,000 men in 7 infantry divisions with 3 cavalry divisions. These divisions were intended to form the entire structure of the German military with no trained reserves available. Of course, this was violated by the maintenance of the Freikorps by the state, but the Allies chose to overlook this. The general staff system, which had been a feature of Prussian and German armies since the age of Napoleon, was abolished. In its place, German generals schemed to preserve the general staff in all but name. 2 of these generals stand above the rest in this preservation, Hans von Seeckt and Walter Reinhardt. They successfully lobbied for a streamlined general staff system under the auspices of the Troop Office in the War Ministry. This success gave the new army the chance to maintain its leadership and continue the professional education of its officers. The last video highlighted the cooperation of the German and Soviet armies and defense industries by the middle of the 1920s. Here we will look at this cooperation again, but from the German perspective. The Soviets wanted technical expertise, plans, and manufacturing equipment. The Germans wanted something else entirely. They looked first and foremost to the Soviet Union's physical vastness and its close nature to the Allies in the West. These attributes allowed the Germans to attempt to experiment with conceptual ideas and formations without raising suspicions that they were rearming. These experiments would form the foundation of mobile warfare doctrine in the next war. It was at the Joint Training Center at Kammer where the Reichswehr first experimented with armored maneuver, and where they learned the importance of radios in conducting those maneuvers. This experience was combined with training exercises and war games conducted in Germany, which formed the root of the doctrinal development of the Combination Motorized Infantry Armor Division. This was a revolutionary formation that differed from the armored forces of the First World War, but its time was still in the future. There was some professional literature on the subject as early as 1917, namely JFC Fuller's presentations to the American Expeditionary Board of an early type of combined arms mechanized cavalry unit. All of the world's armies spent some energy researching the use of larger, division-sized armored units in the 1920s, and it is not clear who first developed the concept. What is clear is that the German army was experimenting with the idea at Kammer by the end of the 1920s, but technology and industry lagged behind intellectual exercises at the moment. The exercises at Kammer used the Like Tractor, an experimental light tank design that had several variants manufactured by different companies. These were rudimentary, even by the standards of the day. They were never intended as anything more than training vehicles, though, but they did pioneer integrated radios for tanks. The cooperation at Kammer was fruitful, allowing the two armies to learn firsthand some of the lessons they would need in the next war. The German army of the 1920s was much more concerned about developing a theory of combined arms mobility than they were about the development of any single weapons system. Their concept of mobile warfare, with motorized infantry and cavalry striking deep into enemy lines, was practiced and then perfected in the army's war games. The officers of the army worked to instill a culture of offensive spirit at the tactical and operational levels. This contrasted with the French military at the time, which was starting its ossification into the defensive mindset that would fail them so spectacularly in the Second World War. Both armies had experienced the worst of the trench fighting and came away with opposite lessons. For the French, the First World War showed that a strong, continuous defensive line was all but impossible to break. To the German army, it demonstrated that only a war of constant movement could overcome the tendency of large armies to settle into positional warfare. These opposing schools of thought were the result of much debate, informed by the experiences, cultures, and strategic pictures of the two nations. The Reichswehr spent the 20s trying to perfect their vision of how tactics would achieve the strategic goals of the nation. The German Navy was crushed by the defeat in 1918. It had suffered battlefield defeat in every major engagement, lost all its major ships, and was treaty restricted from even building its most successful weapon in the U-boat. There were two competing schools of thought, as in all of the navies of Europe at this time. Unlike in the Soviet Union, there was no clear winner in the German Navy. There would be no single doctrine that ruled acquisitions and tactics. Instead, there would be non-stop competition, resulting in a fractured fleet that was never wholly dedicated to one thing or another. The Commerce Raiding School, similar to that of the Jeune École that we discussed in the last video, was further divided into two camps. One that focused on heavy surface raiders, and one that focused on U-boats as the primary arm. Many men throughout the interwar period led the U-boat camp, but Admiral Hermann Bauer laid its intellectual foundations. Eventually, Karl Donitz became the leading man for the U-boat. However, his influence over the Navy's future would not grow to serious levels until the 1940s, when Hitler finally allowed the Wehrmacht to commit to the submarine as a viable weapon. The other side of the Commerce Raiding School of naval thought became known as the Kaiserkrieg or Cruiser War. The Cruiser War concept was perhaps best demonstrated in the building of the famous Panzerschiffs of the late 1920s. These ships were built from the keel up to be fast, powerfully armed commerce raiders that could break into the Atlantic Ocean and beyond, wreaking havoc on the shipping of the world. This concept, so thoroughly modernized with the development of the Panzerschiff, was actually one that had its roots in the pre-Napoleonic era. The first ships of the US Navy were fast, heavily armed frigates, designed to outrun lumbering ships of the line and prey on weaker commerce and their escorts. So too was the Panzerschiff 150 years later. This school was the dominant German naval doctrine in the interwar period, at least until Admiral Erich Raeder became the commander of the Navy in 1928. From that point forward, the Navy worked to develop his preferred battleship fleet, reminiscent of the Imperial German Navy. His tenure would see the building of the Scharnhorst and Bismarck classes and the designing of the monstrously sized H-series of super battleships. These fanciful designs, some as large as 140,000 tons, were the end goal of Raeder's battleship navy. This concludes our video for this week. Next week we'll track the development of the Wehrmacht under the Nazi state, the rise of the SS as a military force, the foundation of the Luftwaffe, and the first trials of the new military machine in the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the prelude to the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. You won't want to miss it, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.